We're deep in the fog of war right now, with the US-Israeli strikes on Iran potentially already turning into a wider war in the Middle East. Nobody knows how this is going to play out, but we can try to understand the factors that will determine where this goes, the goals of the main players, and the constraints that they face in achieving those goals. So we decided to break down these factors for Iran, the US, and Israel, and how they could affect what happens in the next few days. So let's speak to Nicole Grajewski, who's been working on Iran and its nuclear program for years, always aware that a conflict like this could happen. Nicole, it's good to see you. Let's break this down then, step by step, for these kind of main three warring parties right now, starting with Iran. We've obviously seen the impact of these strikes on Iran. We've seen the impact on the leadership, that Khamenei has been killed, other top leaders have been taken out. For those who are now left in charge, what are the primary goals that they'll be pursuing right now?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I mean, in terms of what the Iranian leadership or what is left of it is thinking about, it's primarily regime survival. They've seen the complete decapitation of the main parts of its government, including the supreme leader himself, but also the real threat and intelligence penetration that has pervaded society, partly because of not only the nuclear program, but also in the security services. So for those in charge right now, it seems to be mostly focused on regime preservation and ensuring that there isn't an outbreak or a kind of a spread of protests or kind of unrest that would actually challenge the regime from within.
And this shows that the regime really does go beyond that one individual of Ayatollah Khamenei. It shows the sort of breadth of the regime, doesn't it? We saw the reporting about the level of preparation that went into this, preparation for kind of layers of successors. So do we see that working so far?
Well, we precisely see that the Iranians were prepared for this, and we're prepared for the death of the supreme leader himself. I mean, this is part of the constitution. There is a process for this, but there's only been one instance of real transition, and that was in 1989 when Ayatollah Khamenei died, and that's when you saw Khamenei rise to power and assume the role of supreme leader. But other than that, this is the real first kind of time since then. And so for the Iranians right now, there is a process. This process is somewhat disrupted because there have been assassinations. There is a concern about meeting together with some of these high-level officials and whether or not that could promote a strike. And so to some extent, they are continuing with the kind of institutions, or at least attempting to continue with the constitutional process, though in practice it might look quite different. And you do see different kind of spheres or kind of influences within the government that may play a bigger role than perhaps even the clergy at the moment.
So if we see that the survival of this system as their absolutely overarching goal, this is the goal that tops everything else, then what do you see, first of all, as the tools that they have at hand? They're pursuing at the moment, it seems, a military strategy for survival, right? So they're hitting out. Like, what is the thinking there?
The military strategy at the moment it's somewhat, it's not as impressive as I think that the Iranians wanted it to be. I mean, the missiles for them, their missile kind of based retaliation has long been an assumption that this would deter Israeli or United States attacks on Iranian territory, partly because of the fear and kind of punishment that those missiles could incur on a population. They're not as effective, I mean, as they I guess, intended them to be. And we saw that in October of 2025, but then also in April of 2024, where in October of 2024 and in April of 2024, when the Operation True Promise 1 and True Promise 2 showed the real limitations there. At the moment with the targeting of the Gulf and also towards Israel, it's really about incurring costs, not only in terms of economic costs, but population costs, but of also dissuading, at least in terms of the Gulf, greater involvement in the hopes of potentially having the Gulf pressure the United States to cease military activity. So it's somewhat about attrition. It's partly about punishment. And it's also about compensating for the lack of conventional capabilities that Iran currently possesses, though it's not working exactly according to plan. And there was no real optimism, I think, there when it came to the analytical side of it. I think a lot of analysts weren't expecting Iran to have, miraculous performance when it came to the missiles, but it does show that Iran can disrupt flows of trade akin to markets and also livelihoods of the civilians in these countries.
And of course, we're not just talking about missiles, we're also talking about drones. I mean, Iran is well known as a very proficient manufacturer of drones, supply of drones to the Russians as well. So what role do you see the drones playing compared to the missiles?
Yeah, the drones have been a lot more active in this war than they were in the 12-day war or in previous strikes on Israeli territory. Primarily, the drones have focused on Gulf infrastructure and civilian targets in closer proximity to Iran. Partly because this is also about exhausting, or at least trying to exhaust, U.S. and Gulf allies' interceptor capabilities. Iran is hoping that the intense use of drones on certain civilian or population assets would prompt them to, expend interceptors that they know are valuable, and that may be kind of one of the impetuses to conclude the war on the part of the United States and its allies. And so this seems to be a low-cost strategy at the moment.
Yeah, and just to pick up on those interceptors, because the drones are inexpensive, right? But the interceptors are expensive. So could you just quickly talk through that dynamic and how it becomes a competition between kind of levels of stocks of drones versus interceptors?
Yeah, the Iranians really love to covet about how expensive it is to fight this war with them compared to the kind of marginal cost that they have to pay in order to manufacture these drones and these kind of capabilities. The United States has a limited amount of munitions. There's been an issue within the United States when it comes to kind of the defense production of these, and that's been longstanding. There has been an impact from previous, rounds of escalation with Iran and also with the Houthis that have really exhausted some of those interceptor stocks. Whereas for Iran, they can produce these kind of Shahed drones or the kind of variants of it at a pretty low cost and pretty quickly. Mind you, it only took the Russians a few months to start producing these drones domestically and with the war in Ukraine. So for Iran, it's kind of the ability of them. I mean, I think that the drones really encompass a lot of the constraints Iran has. Cut off from international markets, cut off from a lot of advanced technology, but able to build and quite rapidly these low-cost drones that can actually do quite a bit of damage when they're used.
Yeah, so let's look at the constraints. So those are the tools that Iran is using. The constraints then, I mean, what kind of stocks do they have of them? Missiles on the one hand and drones on the other. At what point in a conflict could they start to run low? Or how much do they have to dose those carefully in the days ahead?
It's been clear that Iran has been conserving some of their missiles. I mean, when you look at the initial response to the attacks on the morning of Saturday morning, those were really smaller smaller missiles per salvo. And that's been a trend that's continued. And if you go back to the 12-day war, Iran did start using less missiles at the very later stages of the war. And partly that might have been an assumption to conserve them, but also because a lot of those missile stocks were either damaged or the missile facilities were bombed and kind of destroyed. So there was that strategy shift there. But what is interesting is actually at the outset, Iran has been using a smaller amount of missiles for each salvo. And additionally, we don't know the state of Iran's launchers. And that's the real bottleneck here. Iran was producing ballistic missiles and actually tried to reconstitute some ballistic missile capability, especially mid-range ballistic missiles, after the 12-day war. But the launchers have been a perennial issue for Iran because those were targeted at the outset of the 12-day war. They have a limited amount of those, and we don't know how much Iran has managed to repair those. Though I would make the contrast and the caveat between Iran's medium-range ballistic missiles and its long-range, and its shorter-range ballistic missiles, because the shorter-range ballistic missiles weren't targeted during the 12-day war. They only were really used at the final stage of retaliation against U.S. base in Qatar. And so Iran did have those stocks already kind of preserved to some extent. Though I think some of the more recent U.S. targeting has shifted to some of the short-range ballistic missile facilities.
And in terms of stocks of the drones, and are drones so cheap and easy to make that can they be churning them out in high numbers now in the situation they're in right now?
I mean, that's unclear. I think some of the drone factories were actually targeted in previous strikes. We don't know the exact number of Iranian drones, but certainly by the amount that they've used them and the kind of intensity that they've used drones throughout this war, with actually little concerned about conserving them. It does seem like Iran has a sizable stockpile there. I mean, it is relatively inexpensive to build these drones, but it's not, completely. Some of the numbers that have been floated are a lot lower than actually what they might actually cost. I mean, I would say around 50,000 to 70,000 US dollars per drone, depending on the model. But that's still very inexpensive compared to, an SM-3 or an SM-2 or an SM-6 kind of interceptor that the United States produces. So it's unclear about what the stockpile is at the moment on a lot of these, because there's conflicting reports and there hasn't been a consistent number floated by either the Iranians or the West at the moment. But it does seem like Iran has quite a bit in reserve, and they can produce these within, a few days or a few weeks, additional ones.
Okay, so just before we move on to the US, let's talk briefly, after talking about those constraints, about what to look out for in the next few days, and particularly what might be signs. For instance, I mean, you say if the overarching goal is regime survival, and the means so far has been military to try to achieve that. But it could be, there have been some hints that they could be also trying to attempt to return to a diplomatic track. What would be the signals that you're looking for there? And do you think that those are credible signals if we are starting to see them?
There's been a lot of contradictory reports coming out. I mean, so on one hand, Trump has said that they're hoping for a negotiated settlement, or that there's been outreach from the leadership of Iran, though it's unclear who is the current leadership beyond President Pezeshkian, who has survived the strikes. It really depends, actually, I think, on a lot of the internal processes in Iran, and whether or not Iran calculates that they can withstand continued strikes on their territory and pretty much the degradation of their military capabilities. You might see certain parts of the Iranian leadership, what remains, making kind of outreach towards the United States and potentially through intermediaries. So what I'm looking for in terms of, going forward are a few things. I mean, Iran's ability to continue firing missiles at Israel and also in the Gulf, if Iran is able to do that for a prolonged period, though that's yet to be determined. We don't know the full extent of damage on Iran's missiles. That might play into the calculus. Whoever is selected as supreme leader, I mean, the process is going on right now. There are meetings with kind of advisory board that essentially will select the next supreme leader, and we don't know who that's going to be. That's really up in the air. There's also the question of the kind of control or the level of actual prominence that the supreme leader will play in the next kind of administration, or I guess the next era of the Islamic Republic, because you could see other political figures who are more entrenched in the military establishment really rising to the fore. And there goes to another kind of side of this is, will the hardliners end up actually prevailing? And, the hardliners have shown, a real desire to continue at a lot of times, the continuation of hostilities with the West, the continuation of hostilities with Israel. So will that play into the calculus when it comes to the solution here? It's all very up in the air. It's hard to really determine what's happening going forward. I think Iran bringing in the Gulf states and Iran targeting the countries in the Persian Gulf or the GCC states, that also shifts some of the calculus as well. Does this mean that Iran will eventually be at war with its neighbors as well? Will they declare war on Iran and be involved in the operations? Or will Iran try to use this as a way of an off-ramp and reaching out to them as well to kind of mitigate the tensions? I mean, all of this is very unknown. It's all up in the air. And it's hard to really pin down what's going to happen next.
Well, that's great. Let's move on then to the US, and then to Israel finally before we wrap this up. So first of all, looking at the US, we started off with the goals that are being pursued. And this is so interesting with the US and with Donald Trump, that he's had a pretty mixed messages in terms of what the goals are. Like what's your current understanding or your current anticipation of what the primary goal is here?
The U.S. hasn't been very consistent with the goals of this operation from the outset. Even in the stages of justifying a potential strike on Iran, it vacillated between nuclear, protests, ballistic missiles. I mean, even in Trump's speech, he invoked the 1979 hostage crisis. So it's unclear what this war is essentially about. But if you're looking at it from an operational perspective, the targeting of leadership, the targeting of Iranian military facilities and also military leadership, it looks like it's intended to degrade the regime and potentially pave way for some kind of different government. The question is whether or not Trump, with kind of the more recent statements about potentially negotiating with the Iranians or that this war will only last a few weeks, whether or not the U.S. has the endurance to actually see that through, and what is the day after going to look like, that still hasn't been clearly articulated. The figures that he's alluded to speaking to are unknown. No one knows who Trump is saying that he's allegedly speaking to in Iran. And so that's also up in the air. So the U.S. kind of objectives here, I think, change day by day. And they're likely to change more, I think, going forward is once the kind of horrific casualties start emerging. I mean, already 3 American servicemen have been killed in this. And if there's more casualties, as Trump actually alluded to, I mean, what is the cost of this war on the American people? And that also includes economic costs. I mean, Trump is very sensitive to disruptions in the market and disruptions in the oil market. And oil prices have already peaked. So how long is the Trump administration going to endure this?
So the goals are unclear. The means so far are military. Yeah, let's look at those constraints. So we have seen in the past, Trump sometimes apparently feels bound in his actions by negative reactions from markets. What are some of the other factors that it has here? I mean, Trump, of course, they put up an enormous force with 2 aircraft carrier groups and a lot of forces all around that. How long can a force like that be sustained at this kind of degree of operations? At what point does that become a constraint?
The U.S. hasn't been very forthright about their military operations so far. We haven't really had a lot of indications about, because a lot of this stuff is classified. I mean, we don't know how many interceptors or munitions that the U.S. currently has in its stockpile. That is classified and it's not shared to the public. So that's an unknown to some extent. In terms of the ability for the carrier strike groups to continue operations, I mean, these are the most advanced capabilities, the most advanced conventional military in the world. They can sustain operations for a few more weeks, definitely, and would have more logistical support. And this is not as much of a constraint, I think, as it actually is on the Iranians in terms of the military operations. But for Trump, I think the main constraint is the domestic reaction in the United States, the volatility of markets, and also the upcoming midterm elections. This could look really terribly on the Trump administration if military operations continue to go awry, and if regime change and kind of this really successful installation of a peaceful Iranian government doesn't actually come to fruition, it will be, I think, something that might taint the Trump administration and definitely impact the midterm elections.
If we look at kind of how things have been going so far, the Americans and the Israelis can claim some significant successes in the kind of decapitation effect. I mean, being able to take the supreme leader out of action on day one, for instance. Would you characterize how they've done so far, at least what we can see through this World War, as successful, at least to this point? But does it bring its own risks as well? Is there a risk of a kind of hubristic sense that, okay, this is going terrifically, and underestimating certain risks?
I mean, the military strategy seems, the operational standpoint, had this been completely bereft of, on the ground realities, I mean, it's been impressive. The U.S. and Israel have coordinated together quite closely, and it looks fine on paper. But when you think about the realities on the ground in Iran, the political side of it, what's going to happen next? Is this going to actually lead to a civil war, an ethnic strife within the country? Is a destabilization of this country going to actually have broader regional repercussions? And instead of having, a democratic transition in Iran, this could also lead to some kind of retrenchment and also a far more repressive government that's far more concerned about, their internal stability. And so ultimately, it seems like the military objectives don't necessarily match with the kind of political effects that might come after.
So before we move on to Israel, so what will be the things that you'll be watching out for with the Americans in the next few days that you would see would be a tell as to which way the Trump administration might be taking this?
It's always a toss-up with the Trump administration that's been quite unpredictable and actually ingenious to some extent when it comes to diplomacy. I mean, if you remember the end of the 12-day war, that happened in a matter of hours, and that was really through back channels between Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. So there could be that kind of back channel discussions, and the end of this war could happen quite suddenly. There's also, I think, some indications that maybe Trump might be exhausted by the certain operations, and you probably would be seeing Truth Social posts about this. I mean, it's hard to really pinpoint what will be the big restraint on the Trump administration. However, congressional pushback seems to be something that's likely. I believe on Tuesday, there will be a meeting about the War Powers Act and whether this is actually a legal intervention or an illegal military campaign. That might be a constraint. Splits within the Republican Party and within Trump's base, that could also be something. But when it comes to like the diplomatic side of it, this is likely going to happen through back channels. It's unlikely it will be like the Ukraine-Russia peace talks. I think that this will happen much more quickly, though that there's also that possibility as well. I mean, it's hard to really pinpoint the U.S. strategy there.
Let's move on to Israel. In terms of goals, the Israelis have been clearer in their objective of a change in the regime, at least a fall of the existing regime. And in fact, Netanyahu already called for that last year during the last strikes last summer. You've talked about the ways in which a fall of this regime could end up with very negative consequences. There could be civil war, there could be breakup of the country, there could be significant turbulence. To what extent is that an important factor for Israel? Is Israel just simply interested in removing the current regime, or how interested in it is it in terms of its own goals in what kind of regime comes next?
Israel seems to be a lot. I mean, you're very right. I mean, Israel is much more cohesive or kind of, I guess, coherent on what their goals are. And it's always been to kind of degrade Iranian military capabilities. What Netanyahu says, eliminate the threat of Iran. And so does that mean a new kind of regime? I think, at least in terms of Israeli statements, it does suggest that. But I think really what is more important for the Israelis at this point is neutralizing Iranian retaliatory capabilities and their ballistic missile program in particular. And then also ensuring that Iran never obtains a nuclear weapon or is never allowed to get to that point of enrichment that could potentially be used for a nuclear weapon. That's, I think, the main Israeli goals. However, there does seem to be an indication that they would like to see a pro-Israeli regime arise, and definitely Israel has supported various opposition groups outside of Iran to in hopes of them assuming power or leading in a transition to power. Those are a lot more ambitious than I think the U.S. current goals are at the moment. I think, and they're more. The Israelis have had years of kind of thinking about this, where it seems like the Trump administration really thought about this kind of on a whim within like the past few months and aligned with some of these Israeli goals.
So let's look at the constraints facing the Israelis. There's a lot of talk about, we talked earlier about incoming drones or missiles versus interceptors. So air defenses as one constraint. How constrained do you see Israel in this situation? Because, of course, it has faced missile barrages over the course of the last year as well, coming in from Iran.
I mean, the United States might potentially be constrained on Israel. And that's been, the case in other instances of flare-ups with the Iranians. But, in terms of the operational side of it, Israel does need, U.S. tankers are quite helpful for the Israelis. Israel doesn't have, a surplus of tankers, unlike the United States. That's one kind of potential constraint. Obviously, as you mentioned, the air defense issue, that's definitely something that the Israelis are thinking about, and also partly because they're reliant on the United States to replenish some of those stocks. There's a domestic context, too. I mean, Israelis have died in this war as well. And a lot of the Iranian missiles now are targeting civilian areas. And so it is also imposing a psychological cost on the Israeli population. And of course, there's Israeli domestic politics and Netanyahu's kind of embattlement with parts of the Israeli, domestic political spectrum, and whether or not that also leads to something as well. But Israel, I think's biggest constraint might actually be the willingness of the U.S. to continue operations.
So looking to the days ahead, what would be the things you're watching out for then, specifically as tells from Israel about which way it might be going?
Usually if there's a schism between Israel and the United States, it tends to be one. I think that if the Iranian missiles continue to break through certain air defenses, even if these are not necessarily high-level targets, but more of the ones that actually Israel chooses not to intercept because they're conserving their interceptors, that's some indication because that is, impacting the population and the infrastructure. Also, potentially a shift in Israel's targeting strategy. There might be, even a more forceful targeting strategy at the very kind of end, or what they see might be at the end of this campaign, because they maybe have some indication the U.S. is, losing its interest. And that actually happened at the end of the 12-day war, where Israel was going to, I think the largest and the most intense airstrikes happened at the very end of the 12-day war. And that was pretty indiscriminate. Israel shifting to a more aggressive targeting strategy. That's one kind of indication. And also just the Israeli domestic politics itself.
Great. So that's a wonderful run through of the three main warring parties here at this stage. I want to bring in, before we finish up, a couple of wildcards. So you referred earlier to the possibility of Gulf states kind of piling in here, so that Iran has been targeting Gulf states, whether Dubai, Bahrain, other countries in the region, in an attempt to impose costs on them, hoping that they would try to push for a resolution. But of course, as you indicated there, it could go the other way, that they might think this is intolerable. We need to actually join this effort in some way. Talk me through a little bit of a scenario there. What could you see happening, and how could that affect the dynamic here?
Well, there's the kind of more escalatory option, which is the Gulf states become actively involved in U.S. and Israeli operations against Iran, and start targeting Iranian territory. And you see the continuation of Iranian targeting of Gulf state infrastructure, oil infrastructure, population centers. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that the economic costs on the countries in the Persian Gulf and the GCC become so kind of great that they actually do seek some kind of resolution, perhaps talking to the United States or via intermediaries. Oman has already indicated that they would potentially intervene or mediate, despite being targeted by the Iranians. So that there's that side of it. You might see the Gulf states coming out with statements that are, condemning Iran, but on back channels trying to urge Iran not to target their territory. I mean, that's a big question here. And if Iran ends up, closing the Strait of Hormuz, I think that is something also to look at, is what is going to be the reaction from the states in the Gulf? Are they going to, find this as so escalatory that they manage to follow U.S. and Israel and continue targeting Iran? Or will this be the kind of crucial moment for them to realize that this war should be resolved and to serve more as an intermediary or a de-escalator in this situation?
And finally, I would like to speak about Russia. You've followed the Russian-Iranian relationship very, very closely. Russia's seen as very close to Iran. Iran obviously helping Russia earlier on in the Ukraine war as well by providing drones to it. At this moment, there's been a lot of talk that this situation is rather exposing the weakness of that relationship, or the inability of the Russians to help Iran out in this moment. I mean, do you see any support from Russia conceivable in this situation, or are there any ways in which Russia might try to make life difficult for the US or the Israelis as this unfolds?
It depends on how long this war is going to last. I mean, the 12-day war ended pretty quickly. There was nothing in that kind of span of, a little over a week for Russia to really provide any kind of material support. Because if you recall, even during the war in Ukraine, when Iran provided drones to Russia, that really only materialized, I think, around August of 2022. So these deals take a while to negotiate. And they also are contingent on whether or not the country has the capabilities to expend some of those resources. The Russians, can provide Iran with potential support in intelligence. They could, allow Iran to tap into GLONASS, which is their pretty much GPS system, but the military version of it. They could provide Iran with satellite imagery and potential movements of, U.S. and Israeli forces. We don't know. That would be much more harder to, see in terms of, compared to arms deliveries, for example. But if Iran, one thing is, if this becomes a very prolonged war, I think you will see the movement of more Russian small arms, or potentially systems that aren't really being in use in Ukraine. And that would be, I think, a big shift. But, the Russia-Iran relationship never was as comprehensive or as deep in terms of military commitments as I think a lot of people assumed because of the war in Ukraine. It was really for both countries to survive, moments of peril, but not together. Essentially providing the means to do that on their own, essentially. But I don't see the Russians at the moment really being able to provide much, because what Iran does need is, they might need more missiles and munitions. Maybe the Russians can provide or return some of the alleged short-range ballistic missiles that Iran shipped to them, but not the launchers, apparently. Maybe the Russians can help Iran in that end, but I don't know. It's still unclear, and it really is dependent on how long this war lasts. And that's, I think, the biggest.
And can you even imagine how that would be logistically possible under the situation that we have right now with this war taking place?
Well, it would probably happen through the Caspian Sea, which is where the main kind of conduit transfers have been. But targeting a Russian ship, would also maybe potentially bring Russia into this conflict. So this is all, I think Russia's cautious. I don't think Russia wants to be involved in a war with the US or with Israel or even with the Gulf states. And that's where I actually think the Russians can be somewhat constructive, is serving somewhat as a mediator between Iran and the states of the GCC, because they do have good relations with the majority of those states. They've attempted in the past to serve as a de-escalator or mediator, and it benefits them, because for them, having beneficial relations with both Iran and the GCC has worked out thus far. And so you might see Russia trying to come in there. I don't think there's a lot of goodwill left with the Russians and the Israelis because of October 7th. But in terms of the Gulf, the Russians could potentially be helpful there, even if it's behind the scenes and kind of in the shadowy annals of policy.
Nicole, thanks so much. That's been a really great briefing. I think I feel really better equipped to think about the next few days thanks to that. Appreciate it. And I hope that we can come back to you at some point a little further through this conflict to get an update. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you for having me.